Hi everyone, welcome to your library at home. My name is Rebecca. I work here in the public programs team at the State Library of New South Wales. I'd like to begin this evening by acknowledging that we meet on country. I live and work on Gadigal land and I pay my respects to elders past, present and especially emerging. And I'd like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal Australians who may be joining us online this evening. Welcome to another fantastic instalment of the B-List online book club. I'm going to head over to Bree very shortly, but before I do, I just wanted to share some library news with you. We are very excited to be holding the announcement of the National Biography Award 2020. We're holding this award ceremony online on Friday, August 28th. The National Biography Award celebrates excellence in biography, autobiography, and memoir writing. This year, State Librarian Dr. John Vallance will announce the overall winner, who will receive a $25,000 prize. We'll also be announcing the winner of the Michael Crouch AC Award for Best Debut Biography with a total value of $5,000 in prize money. Please join us online at 7 p.m. next Friday, the 28th of August to hear this announcement. There's no need to register, simply jump online at 7 p.m. to see the online stream. I'd like to now hand over to Bree with a quick reminder for all of you at home. If you have any questions this evening, please don't hesitate to send them through the Q&A section of the Zoom app, where we can moderate those questions at the conclusion of today's talk. Thank you for joining us on behalf of the library, and I'd like to now hand over to Bree.
Good evening, everybody. I had planned that slide would be a little smoother, but thank you so much for spending another Thursday evening with me here at the State Library. Normally I would be coming to you from my home, but I am currently moving home. So Beck and the State Library team have been lovely enough to let me back in here. And it's so lovely to be back in the library. And I really wish you all were here with me for a normal B-List book club as well, and especially to any Melbourne friends tuning in, but to everyone in general. I hope with COVID-19 you're all still doing well. I would also like to acknowledge that I am on what always was and always will be Aboriginal land, that sovereignty was never ceded and a treaty has never been signed, and I support the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Our guest author tonight writes, amongst other things, about nature and this beautiful country. And for anyone at home who's read either of his novels, I'm sure you shared a feeling of both gratitude for country and also a mourning, of course, of what we have lost and what has been destroyed since settlement. So that's what I mean when I say tonight in particular that I acknowledge that I am on Aboriginal land. The guest for tonight, I'm so thrilled, who's joining us is author Robbie Arnott. I absolutely adored his second novel, The Rain Heron, which is what we will be talking about tonight. Robbie Arnott was a 2019 Sydney Morning Herald Best Young Novelist and won the Margaret Scott Prize in the 2019 Tasmanian Premier's Literary Prizes. His widely acclaimed debut, Flames, the new cover for which is absolutely gorgeous, looks like this, in 2018 was shortlisted for a Victorian Premier's Literary Award, a New South Wales Premier's Literary Award, a Queensland Literary Award, the Readings Prize for New Australian Fiction, and not the Booker Prize. Robbie Arnott lives in Hobart, where hopefully he is joining us now live. Robbie, are you there?
Hi, Bree.
Wonderful. Hi, Robbie. Thank you so much for joining us.
Not at all. Thank you so much for having me.
How are you? How are you doing okay with Hobart lockdown?
Yeah, there is no Hobart lockdown anymore. There hasn't been for a while. We're incredibly lucky. I'm going back to work. It's pretty much back to normal down here, except for the fact that we can't leave and no one's allowed in, or our Premier will do something horrible to you, apparently.
Okay, well, Melbourne watching friends, don't listen to what Robbie just said.
Sorry, everyone from Melbourne.
So I would like to just remind everyone briefly, and I will remind you again later on, that if you have any questions for Robbie, to type them into the Q&A chat function. I will be moderating them towards the end. So, Robbie, I absolutely loved The Rain Heron. I feel like maybe I am in the minority of people who came to The Rain Heron first. And then as soon as I finished it, went out and bought Flames and read that as well, because I remember when Flames came out, everyone was reading it, everyone was raving about it. Congratulations on your second book.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm so glad you liked it. Thanks heaps.
No worries. So going straight into it, when we begin reading The Rain Heron, in particular after anyone who's read it would know that the very early section has, how would you describe it? The fable of the Rain Heron itself, like the myth, the origin of the legend?
Yeah, I guess it's just a myth that starts the novel. It's a myth I made up about the Rain Heron that functions as a bit of a fable to the people in the world of the novel.
And then after we hear about this short section of the myth, I'm very interested in when we meet our first sort of protagonist, Ren. And we spend a long time with Ren, or what felt like a long time for me, reading without knowing. I didn't know what year it was, what country it might have been, sort of how old she might have been. Like, why did you choose to sort of start this story almost with such little sort of external information to Ren's situation?
It's a great question. Thank you. I wanted to write about a character living in the wilderness where all of her actions were what determined what the reader knew about her and how her story was propelled forwards. I didn't want to sketch her out with all these details and backstory. I wanted, almost as a writer and for readers, for us to come to know her through what she was doing and what she was going through. I thought that was the best way almost to get to know her. And it revealed a lot more about her character and her motivations by what she goes through in those first 50 pages. And I thought that was a more interesting way to tell her story rather than just saying, here's Ren, she's come to this mountain for this reason, and this is everything about her, and this is how old she is, and this is the color of her hair. I wanted to get straight into what was happening to her.
And tell us a bit about what she's doing, because she's surviving off the land, but there are ways in which we learn that, she hasn't always done this. It's been a steep learning curve.
Yeah, essentially she's living in an unnamed country that's in the last few years gone through a military coup, and she's fled the major civilization centers of that country because she wants to live as a survivalist off the land. It's not made that clear exactly why she wants to leave, other than she is very sick of people, and she doesn't want anything to do with what's happening to the country or the people who are running it. And so she's gone to live on a mountain that she went to when she was a child because she just has fond memories of it, and she likes the idea of being self-sufficient. It doesn't go as well as she kind of imagined, but she finds a way to exist living in the wilderness. And all she wants to do is be apart from people and live in this beautiful place. And then as the novel takes off, her peace is quite rudely interrupted.
There is a tension there where she is very reliant on one friend in particular.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
She develops a trading relationship with a character named Barlow. And in her first few years on the mountain, that becomes very important to her survival. And I put that in the novel because I felt it was the most realistic way to show how someone would live out there, because it seemed a bit, I know this is weird to hear from someone who just makes crazy stuff up in his books all the time, but it seemed almost too unrealistic that it would be too hard for someone to go just set up camp and just live off the land for someone who's come from a kind of more modern civilization. But as she goes on, she becomes a bit more self-reliant and more self-sufficient. But she is very reliant on this trading relationship with a friend, yes.
I would love, in particular for anyone who hasn't read either of your books, I would love if you would do a short reading for us from this section with Ren. If you would, because I just think, as well as there are so many sort of themes and issues we're going to talk about, but the way you use words to just paint the picture of the landscape is fantastic. If you would read for us, that would be fantastic. Thank you, Robbie.
Sure, thanks, Brett. I'm just going to read a couple of pages from towards the very start of the novel, where we just learn a bit about Ren and how she's come to live on the mountain and what she's doing there. In the 5 years since she'd come to the mountain, Wren had almost died on many occasions. Early on, starvation nearly killed her. Then she nearly died of malnutrition and the fevers and sickness that came with it. She nearly froze. In a cool, happy stream, she nearly drowned. She was nearly gored by a boar, nearly kicked to death by a cornered buck. She nearly poisoned herself with hemlock tea. She nearly fell from a cliff 3 times and narrowly missed being crushed by tumbling rocks on many others. All her preparations, her research, all the books she'd read, none of it prepared her for the sheer rush of death that comes with being in the wilderness. But she did not die, thanks to the shelter she found in the cave, to the foraging and survival skills she cobbled together, to her thick vein of stubbornness. And mostly she didn't die because of Barlow. She'd met him a few weeks after she arrived. She had not yet discovered the cave and was wandering between shelters, eating her supplies, coming to the realization that the mountain was going to kill her. On a low slope, she saw him with his son foraging for mushrooms, maybe nuts. She saw that he moved slowly, calmly, that he was careful with his footsteps and voice, that he was patient and kind towards the boy, a loud spinning top of a child. Soon they stopped foraging and went back to the village, and Wren felt something hook in her chest as she watched them leave. Days later, she saw him again in the meadow, again with his son. She watched and waited, wondering if they would climb higher. The third time she saw him, he was alone, angling for trout with a bamboo pole. He caught a single fish in an hour of casting, and as he packed his bag and turned to leave, Wren stepped out from behind a tree, revealing herself without planning to, without thinking about it. He turned. He was coming towards her. She could have stayed hidden, but something flicked in her head, a snap of loneliness or need, and she stepped out before him. If he was surprised, and he must have been surprised, he didn't show it. He greeted her and asked no personal questions. They spoke about nothing in particular for a while before Wren, conscious of his meagre haul, offered him a handful of the milk cap mushrooms she'd been collecting. He put them in a side pocket of his backpack, then opened another section and pulled something out, which he offered to Wren. It looked like a piece of wool. After a pause, she took it, feeling beneath her fingers the fibre, warm and soft. She stretched it out and saw that it was a woolen hat. For the mushrooms, Barlow said, and for winter. It set a simple precedent. They would meet at a large rock in the pines and trade in ways that kept Wren alive, although Barlow never admitted that these trades were weighted in her favour. For mushrooms and berries, he traded a rod of steel to sharpen her knife. For a crown of antlers she found on a buck skeleton, he gave her a head torch and a pack of batteries. Once she began catching deer in her traps, she began asking for things in advance: boots, vitamins, and vegetable seeds. Wren knew that most of these trades were more beneficial to her. A basket of nuts was never a fair swap for a pair of fleece gloves. But she chose not to let her pride get in the way of these meetings. And sometimes the trades did go in Barlow's favour. Once she found a large angular rock that gave off a strange glow, with multiple points of light varying in colour from white to pink to yellow, glittering out of its pocked surface. She gave it to Barlow in exchange for a tube of disinfectant cream. As his hand closed around the rock, she saw his eyes, usually calm and guarded, gleam with wild knowledge. He stammered a thanks, asked if she knew what it was, offered to give her more for it, much more, but she refused. She did not mind, and she did not need more. He never asked why she was living on the mountain, where she had come from, and Wren never asked him anything about what he did, how he lived, if he had a wife, and if that wife was the mother of his son, even though she found herself wondering about this late at night and in the glow of morning. They didn't talk about his son either. She had asked Barlow not to bring him to their meetings. Of all the people she did not want to be around, children were at the top of the list. Children and young men, even one that seemed as harmless and light-hearted as the boy she'd seen zooming about on the slopes. She knew what young men could do, no matter how inane they appeared, how joyful and innocent. She knew how they could change and be changed. She knew in her head and blood and hands, and she wanted none of it. None at all. Never again.
Thank you. We get the feeling that Wren has figured out finally how to survive almost alone, with the exception of, trading with Barlow for those items. And she's it's almost like she's found a groove. And we meet her when she's like going through her daily motions and still has an incredible sense of wonder for the environment, but is not in quite such a sort of perilous situation anymore. But then for the reader, there's a huge catalyst with the arrival of troops. Who are they? Why are they there? What happens?
Yeah, some soldiers turn up, and they've been sent by the kind of mysterious military running this country, and they've been sent to search for a myth. And sorry, it's probably not giving anything away. They've been sent to search for the rain heron, which they believe to be living on this mountain because of stories that people know throughout the country. And it's not clear whether or not the rain heron does or does not exist. No one's really sure. And the leader of these troops, a woman named Lieutenant Harker, discovers that Wren lives on the mountain, and she comes to believe that if anyone knows where the rain heron is, if it's real, it would be the hermit woman living on the side of the mountain, who's closest to nature of everyone. So what happens then is these troops, particularly led by Lieutenant Harker, try and coerce Wren into helping them find this animal that maybe exists.
Does Lieutenant Harker actually believe it though? Or do any of them? I found like the lengths they go to sort of, I thought coerce was a generous word. They basically like sort of guerrilla warfare torture Wren into sort of finally collapsing and giving in and giving them the information. And it seems like it's all the more brutal because you get the sense that the soldiers aren't even really sure if the rain heron exists.
Yeah, there's a particularly cool nature to Lieutenant Harker, who really isn't very nice. I don't want to give too much away about who she is or what she does. But there's a moment in the book where she comes to believe that Wren does know where the rain heron is. There's an exchange between them where she starts believing it, and then she will never give up and she won't let go. And there's also the fact that this isn't a mission that they're really allowed to fail. It becomes clear that the military running the country don't accept failure. So even if she doesn't necessarily believe it, she feels that she has to use every tool in her arsenal to at least try. And that comes at the great cost to Wren.
Moving away from the plot for a moment, something that struck me about the rain heron and then struck me even more so after reading Flames is that most books will pick one or two people to really stay with. And the rain heron, I feel like, has a cast of about half a dozen, and Flames even more so has a broad cast. And I was wondering if you felt either or something in between. Is it that you get pushed away from the idea of writing about one, maybe two people, or is there something that pulls you towards writing from so many different voices and perspectives?
It's probably a mixture of both. I haven't liked any of my characters enough to want to spend a whole book with them in any of the books I've written. And I really like the idea of using different narrative viewpoints and telling one story from multiple characters' points of view and exploring them in a way that feels really fresh and invigorating to read. When I've sat down and written The Rain Heron and Flames, I didn't sit down with these characters in mind who I was obsessed with and I wanted to tell their stories. I had more of an overarching, I wanted to write about the environment. I wanted to put characters in these worlds and write about place as characters move through them and how they were interacted with place. And that's what drove me in writing these two novels. So that lent itself to having a range of characters as opposed to following a particular protagonist. That's kind of how it happened, but I don't really know what I'm doing. So it's kind of fallen out that way without me sitting down with a great motivation and grand plan to have, polyphonic voices telling a story. It just kind of happens.
I read in an interview that that you said that it's not until quite a way through writing that you even decide what gender some of the characters might be. Can you, that blows my mind. How is that possible? What is this sort of calcification process of these people coming to life?
Yeah, when I didn't know that, particularly the Rain Heron, I didn't know that Wren and Lieutenant Harker were going to be women. I wanted to write about these characters who were in this situation, trying to deal with a quite perilous and beautiful landscape, and also interacting with the myth and trying to live normal lives, or seemingly normal lives, or being influenced and interacting with myth and fable. And I just thought that'd be interesting. And as I got into the plot and writing it out, it just made a whole lot more sense to me that particularly that Wren was a woman. And it's not something that I feel I can really explain in a really erudite academic way. It's more that the key defining trait for her as I was writing was her resilience. And the same with Lieutenant Harker in a way. She's very, very resilient in a kind of much less pleasant way. And in both those traits just felt much more feminine traits to me, and they felt more like women as I wrote them. I didn't think it was interesting to have a man in the wilderness toughing it out, eking out his existence in this kind of brave white hunter style. It just didn't seem very interesting to me. And I found Wren's quiet resilience much more interesting, and she felt a lot more like a woman I know and women I know. And it made the whole story make a lot more sense to me. And by then, I was so far into the books I'm doing, I started thinking, should I be writing about women like this? And by then it was too late. And I just had to do the best job I possibly could, and hope I did it the feminine perspective justice. Yeah, but it was too late. Yeah.
You mentioned that, like, sort of the one of the sort of, I guess, one of your impetus at the beginning is not so much that you have these sort of characters speaking to you, but that you want to see how people might respond to that environment. But something that struck me when I reread The Rain Heron is just how many of the plot points, or the kind of various sort of narrative circles and different voices have points where they overlap and intersect. Does that wouldn't that require a significant amount of sort of plotting? Like, do you start with the grand plan for how they all connect, or is it something in between that you sort of work through?
It's a giant mess, and I feel lucky that it even works out. You know how some writers have like the whiteboard and they plot all the character points out, or they look like the guy in Serpico with this coloured threads. It just happens as I go along. It's just chaos. And when certain elements of the plot start to influence each other, I think that I might have done that subconsciously, but I don't know. And then normally when I'm on a really long walk and I figure out these plot points and these characters' intersections in a way that feels satisfying, that I feel like it'd be satisfying to read, I almost feel like it's a fluke. I'm like, oh God, that's worked out. Maybe I did this deliberately. And there's lots of dead ends too. Like with writing most things, there's all these dead end plot points and things that I pursue that don't work out. So it's not like I just have one way and it magically happens. But the fact that it kind of seems to work out in a way that at least to me feels a bit satisfying or reconcilable. Yeah, I don't feel anything other than just pure luck at that. I don't know if I'm alone or if that happens to other novelists, but yeah, there's no big plot or no big giant overarching plot that I'm sticking to. It's just seat of my pants stuff, really.
This blows my mind. I'm the sort of sociopathic serial killer, red string, post-it note, numbered, like wannabe beautiful minder. Like it's amazing to me that you could see what happens. Like I can't handle it. It's incredible.
Yeah, I stand in the shower for like an hour, like 3 a.m, just talking to myself. And my fiance wants to kill me. But sometimes that's the only way to sort it out, because I can't sleep if I'm like, I've just got a whole chapter that doesn't make any sense. I think I don't know what I'm doing.
Well, it works. So yeah, let's not overthink it. So The Rain Heron, as we mentioned, the beginning is this sort of fable part. I want to talk a bit about the fantastical elements in The Rain Heron, and also in a moment about flames. With The Rain Heron starting with the fable, do you feel like that requires a kind of trust from the reader? Like, do you feel like, because so much of the rest of the book, in particular for me, I read somebody else describe it as an ecological thriller, and I was like, yes, that's what it is, because so much of the rest of it, it's beautifully written, but it also has this rollicking plot. But it begins with something that, do you think, requires a sense of like trust or faith from the reader to just follow where you're going? Is that something you think about or thought about?
Yeah, it actually is. I think that's a really good way of putting it. I worked in bookshops for like 7 years, and like most writers, I'm a big reader, and I think readers are really smart. I think people who read books are really clever, and I think you can trust them to follow you and go along with it. And I think you do require trust of people to go along with you, but if they're enjoying it, they will. And if they don't, the worst thing that can happen is they just put the book down. But I think it's more satisfying to read if you are in the hands of a novelist who trusts you and says, I'm not going to spoon feed this to you. I'm not going to explain everything and hold your hand to make sure you're with me the whole way. I just think it's a more satisfying reading experience to kind of be confused a bit at the time, but as long as there's enough going on that you want to keep reading. And all you can do really as a writer is write something that you want to read. And that's all I try to do really. And I think that I would go along with this, I believe. And so I have to trust that other people will too, because I'm not going to condescend to them, and I'm not going to try and, put every plot point in there just in case anyone's feeling anxious. I think you trust people. And like I said, readers are clever and they'll figure it out. And it's more fun that way anyway.
I have, which is completely my fault, it's my lacking. I have a terrible history of becoming frustrated with magical realism. And just for a very many years, just wrote off the entire colossal genre. And something about that for me was that I read, I think, a few in a row where I couldn't figure out what the rules were. Like, it doesn't matter to me if I feel like in your novels, for example, that some of the rules of what we would describe as the real world are bent. So long as I get the sense that the author knows what those parameters are. And otherwise there's sort of, I find it difficult to know what the stakes are. For example, if I'm halfway through the book and then realize that somebody could just be alive until 180, then I'm no longer sure of what stakes old age might have. Can you talk a little bit about, because now it's been 2 books that you have had some degree of these fantastical elements. How do you come up with the universal rules, or are there sort of parameters even for the fantastical?
Yeah, it actually comes back to what we were talking about earlier. A lot of it comes down to trust. And another thing is instinct. Instinct, I try and write things that to me are interesting, that I think fit the world of the novel and fit the story I'm telling, that don't jar. It's really not that different to other writing rules. It's like writing dialogue. You don't want it to jar. You don't want it to snag. It's like writing descriptive passages. You want to have a really nice rhythm that will draw someone onwards and is pleasing to read. So when coming up with something fantastical in a book, or coming up with a really imaginary element, it's the same thing. It's like, does it have a pleasing rhythm? Is what you've come up with out of kink with everything else in the story, or does it enhance it in a way without snagging? And there's no set rule. I don't make up a world of set hard and fast rules for these fantastical things I've put in the 2 books. I just try and ask if it enhances the book, and if it is pleasing, and if it is believable within the world I've constructed so far. And if it is, I then try and consciously lean into the imaginative side of it. I go, cool, I believe this. It's not snagging. It's not prompting me to ask further questions. It's not raising questions that are kind of tie the rest of the book in circles. And then I lean into the imaginative side of it. And what is this magical element actually conveying? That's kind of how I do it. I don't sit around and be like, okay, to do a magic spell, you need a wand with either a dragon heartstring or a unicorn horse tail feather in it, tail hair in it. And that's how anyway, I don't worry about too much about that, because I don't think it matters for these 2 books I've written. It's if it enhances the text and is pleasing to read and doesn't raise questions. And I think that's all you can really do. I know in proper fantasy novels, there's these big debates about what is kind of hard fantasy and soft fantasy, and I don't really know anything about it. But I just try and lean into the imaginative elements that I think are pleasing without snagging.
Can you tell us specifically about how you came up with or started shaping the idea for the creature, the rain heron, the creature specifically?
Yeah, so I knew I really wanted to write this nature fable at the start of the book. I knew I wanted to open it. I thought it would be lots of fun. And I thought it would be really interesting. And I wanted to create this creature that almost embodied the fierceness and savagery of nature, while also embodying the sheer beauty of it. I wanted both those things to exist within this one animal in this kind of impossible mythic sense. I thought of it more like a myth than, you know, anything magical, which they're kind of similar, but in some ways they're not. And when I thought about it, I realized I was kind of just thinking about a storm, in the way that looking at a storm, they're incredibly beautiful, but they'll also kill you. And also importantly, that nature doesn't care about people. That's one thing that kind of throws me off a little when I'm reading something that involves animals or magical realist elements, where these things are deeply concerned with humans. Because even though I make stuff up, in the real world, nature's not concerned with people at all. You know, a tiger doesn't care if it eats a person or if it eats a deer. It's not fussed what that person does. So I wanted to create this mythical creature that was powerful and beautiful and savage, and also just didn't give a shit about people, because why would it? And it made sense to me that it'll be a bird, and it made sense that it'll be made of water. And then I just cobbled it together. There were lots of different versions of it. I won't bore you with telling about all the different versions of the rain heron before it became the rain heron. But yeah, that's how I went about it.
One of my favorite things, and I think what made it so compelling, is that the rain heron didn't give a shit about us. Is that it made it so unpredictable and so much more, engaging or real. I agree. There's even at some stage, isn't there, one of the characters who thinks that they can like communicate with it just by like looking at it in the eye and having a connection with it. And I remember reading that being like, oh no, come on. And then the rain heron is like, doesn't give a shit. I was like, yes.
Yeah, I'm very big on animals not get. I've got a cat and it's a bastard and I love it. But yeah.
Elsewhere in the book though, I'd love to talk about a bit about the middle section that takes place completely off the mountain. Because as much as the rain heron, you know, is fantastical, is a creature, doesn't give a shit about human beings, there's also this next sort of section or passage of the book where the humans have an incredibly sort of symbiotic relationship with a different creature, the squid. Can you, I don't think it's, I also don't like spoilers, but I don't think it's a spoiler if you could maybe talk a bit, for anyone who hasn't read the book, I guess, about this sort of seaside town and about this other sort of creature-human relation.
Yeah, so it's another strand of the novel that does tie in. I promise it does tie into the main plot. It's not just me wasting time. It's a small town set on the south coast of this country, where there's one industry there. It's a very cold, isolated little town. And the industry is collecting ink from squids, a particular type of squid and a particular type of ink that has all sorts of, not magical properties, but just very powerful properties. And the way in which these people in this town harvest the ink, they keep very, very secret, and they never tell anybody. And it's a very symbiotic relationship they have with the squid. It's almost a shared process, almost a mutually beneficial relationship between the people and the squid. I won't go into exact detail about how it's done, but it's something that I wanted to explore, where there could be this group of people who are having this very interlinked relationship with nature and depending upon it to live, without completely destroying it or dominating it. I wanted to have this symbiotic relationship between nature, because I think that's existed for a long time in many communities around the world. And just because the overriding way that we treat the world now is one of exploitation and degradation doesn't necessarily mean that we've always been like this, or that all people have always been like this, or that we necessarily need to. And I wanted to explore that in the book because it was interesting to me, and I thought it fit the world of the novel. And it allowed me to write about the ocean and about squid, both of which I really like.
There's a man who comes to this small town. He's called the Northerner. And he arrives. He's one of the outsiders who the people in this small community don't want to talk about. He arrives. He wants to know the secret of how they get this squid ink. And he uses phrases like he wants to modernize their practice. Like, he's there to help them so that he can, like, once he learns it, he can help them make it sustainable and like more profit making. And I remember just being sort of really grossed out by that, like corporate lingo and that sort of startup kind of, what do they call it? Like kind of hacking, maximizing growth chat. And then when I started researching for our conversation this evening, I read somewhere that you did work as copywriting in advertising. I was wondering if that like sort of if that was one of the places where you got that sort of such a different language from, this idea of growth and exploiting and using.
Yeah, I still work as a copywriter, and I've got to be careful what I say so I don't get fired. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of corporate jargon, and I think jargon is not only is it a shield that people hide behind in order when they don't know what they're talking about, but also jargon can be weaponized to obscure truth and to obscure the real meaning of what you're trying to say. So I wanted to have this guy who wanted to present himself as this really reasonable person, and he couldn't understand why everyone wasn't on board with him wanting to turn what was already a sustainable and ecologically wonderful industry into something exploitative. But he's using that language of corporate capitalism to kind of couch his offers. And it just made sense to me that that's what someone like him would do. Because that's how, not only how he'd frame his offer, but also how he'd go to sleep at night, thinking, I've step changed this industry and we've pivoted from something to, a modernized setting where all the various learnings and it's tough because I almost didn't want to write it because I hate jargon so much, but it just made sense to me that that's what he would say.
Just for everyone watching at home, I have only time for 2 or 3 more questions for Robbie, and then I will be making sure I get to everyone's questions, and I can see a bunch of you have written some already. Please keep typing them through. You write a lot about the environment and about how futile it can be for humans to try and control that, and yet simultaneously how devastating it is when we do try and control it and dominate it, as you just mentioned. And there are various characters who learn to move with their environment or the weather, and various characters who keep just like sort of slamming up against it. I want to ask you how you, as somebody who cares about the environment and has opinions, tries to write books exploring these themes without them ending up as just sort of didactic soapbox like rants. How do you manage that?
Yeah, it's tricky. That's the worst thing that could happen, I think, is if I wrote a didactic book, it would just kill it. I'd hate that. And it does come down to having mutual respect, I think, between a writer and a reader. I like the idea of, instead of trying to present what I think or what I think should happen or what my opinion is, I think the trick is to present not the trick, but what I tried to do was present a scenario and present a situation and then lay it on the page and allow people to take from it what they will and leave it open for multiple interpretations. I try not to write with judgment. I just try to write clearly and truly about these things that I think are important. And I think you allow people to bring their judgment to the page or their own experiences or their own take on things. Because I think it's a more productive way of actually thinking about these things. Not only does it make for better fiction, I believe, give you actually about something, write a piece for The Guardian. But I think it's also just a more productive and collaborative way of viewing a piece of fiction. I think people get more out of it that way when they feel like they're bringing their own experiences to the text as well, and when there's multiple things that can be taken out of it. It is tricky not to present things too black and white, but then again, nothing really is that black and white. And I know I've spoken a bit about the exploitation of the environment and how bad it is, and it's quite clear in my books, I guess, that I'm not really a fan of open cut coal mining, but I think it's something that it's just both more enjoyable and more useful for everybody involved if it's something that's a two-way conversation. There's no point just sitting here going, this guy wanted to come and kill all these squid and he was a total arsehole in the end. That's not a good piece of fiction. I think it's more interesting when you have those shades of grey.
Something I found really satisfying about both your novels is that they like somehow tread a line between having a sense by the end of like sort of closure and a finish without it feeling like any sort of forced sense of like every possible, not being tied off or any kind of like trick and here's how it all fits together. I'm interested to hear your response both as a reader and a writer about whether or not you feel like as a reader you crave to have things, sort of finished properly or to have some sense of an ending of a book, and then whether or not that correlates to your plans for the endings of your books as a writer.
Yeah, as a reader and as a writer, I don't crave an ending or a sense of an ending, but what I do crave is a sense of satisfaction. So I want to put down a book after the last page and be satisfied by what's happened towards the end. I don't feel like it's been rushed to an ending for the sake of having an ending, nor do I feel like I want it just to peter out and be left hanging. So I don't feel like I need to have a strict control or knowledge of what happens to these characters in the rest of their lives or what happens to them at the very end. But I just want that sense of satisfaction to feel like I've been rewarded for for following this story. And that's what I aim for as a writer, for a sense of satisfaction in both the stories of the individuals in the book and of the novel as a whole. That's kind of the thing I'm aiming for, just this vague sense of satisfaction that I feel like I haven't wasted my time with this. This has been worth it. That's probably the best I can do with that one, I think. Endings are really hard.
I'm going to move to some audience questions now because I can see one of the first ones is also an overlap with a question I didn't get to. And this is a question from Amy, who says that she also loved the book and she's curious if there was any particular landscape that the scenery was based on. Was it somewhere in Tassie or completely made up? And a question I had as well was whether or not you took notes while you were out and about on one of your many walks.
Yeah, really good question. Thank you, Amy. The first part of the book, basically, where Ren is on the mountain, I based that on parts of Japan and Europe because I just had this idea of a conifer forest. Because I'd done a bit of hiking in Hokkaido, the North Island of Japan, and that just completely blew me away. And a little bit in Europe. This makes me sound like I'm really well travelled. They're the only places I've been outside of Australia. But I went to do hiking in those regions, and I wanted to just convey that in the book. I felt like that was a good setting for the rain heron and where it would live. And then other parts of the book are based more on Highland. I got to where there's a sanctuary towards the end of the book, and there's lots of pencil pines and cider gums and things like that. And I based that kind of rocky, tarn-like area on Tasmania. But overall, no, I don't take lots of notes. I do a lot of intense looking, and I look like a total weirdo. I just stand still on the side of trails and stare at trees for ages. And I take a few notes, like on my phone or in a notebook, and then like just heaps of, like I spend so much time Googling trees and reading. My friend's dad is like a nature biologist, and he just lends me these little notebooks that always have the little scientific details of all trees. And it matters so much to me that I don't get those bits wrong. And I probably should spend more time on character motivations, but lots of reading about trees after looking at them for ages.
Well, the other two questions I'm going to go to are very much about character from people who are very engaged with them. So I don't think that the character motivations are likely at all. There's a question from an anonymous attendee. The character of Harker seems to embody the complexity of our relationship with each other and with the environment. What were the main criticisms, if any, you were hoping to make through that character or with that character?
Well, thank you very much for the question. Again, I wasn't seeking to make overt criticisms. I don't feel that's the place of the novelist, or at least my role as a novelist. But what I was hoping to explore was how we can have this exposure to the despoilation of nature, as Lieutenant Harker does towards early on in her story. And it doesn't necessarily change who we form us into a better person or change us into someone who's, oh, I've seen this awful thing happening to nature, therefore I'm going to not be like that. It can have subconscious elements linked through us. So early in her life, she has a very, very rich relationship with nature. And then as she gets older, particularly towards the point of the novel when she's on the mountain, she's seeking very much to harm it and very much not looking after it or not having a good relationship with nature. And all I was trying to portray there was that people's lives are complicated and we can end up doing a lot of harm when we focus on ourselves and focus on kind of arbitrary goals and lose sight of how we should be taking care of the world and taking care of each other. Because I think the violence we enact upon each other is mirrored in the violence we enact upon nature. And if anything, that's what I wanted to explore with Harker, how violence always begets more violence, not just on other people, but on the world around us.
So that's really interesting. Your answer kind of is very relevant to the last question we have time for, which is how I'm paraphrasing this question so it doesn't give away any plot points, but is how we're supposed to feel about Harker sort of by the end of the book, because we learn, like as you just mentioned then, that she used to have a really wonderful, engaged relationship with nature, and by the end it's definitely not the case. And I feel like you've already answered that a bit in terms of saying that you don't want to tell people what to think. So what I would actually love to know is what you think about Harker by the end of the book.
Oh, I don't really know. Like I still think she's pretty horrible. I think a lot of people are used to reading a pretty straight redemption arc for a character. And so when they get to the end and she hasn't been totally redeemed at all, people think, oh, what am I meant to think about her? Well, I don't really know what to think about her. I think she's done some horrible things. I don't think she's an evil person. I think she's a very complex person who's done some very awful things and is starting to realize just how awful she's been and is hoping to not be like that anymore, hoping to change the way she is. But she's gone through a lot of trauma, and she's both inflicted horrors on people and had horrors inflicted upon her. And what I feel about her at the end of the book is that she is learning, but she's not fixed and she's not a good person. She's learning. I think that's all any of us can really hope for. I thought it was more accurate to how people are to have her that way rather than have her be awful or benevolent. I think she's morally dubious, as many of us are, but she's done some pretty awful things, and I don't know if I could forgive her.
Interesting. Well, those are all the questions for this evening that I had. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's B-List. Before everyone leaves, I just have to announce what next B-List Book Club books are. So sorry, you have to hang on for just one moment, Robbie.
No, it's okay.
We have another very super special. This is the silver lining of B-List not being able to be in person, is that we can have, for example, Robbie in Hobart and the occasional international author special. On the first Thursday of September, which I believe is the 3rd, the event link is live now. I will be speaking to Keelan Hughes, talk about her second novel, The Wild Laughter. Keelan's first novel, called The Orchid and the Wasp, was my favourite novel of, I believe it was 2018, and I got to interview her for the Sydney Writers' Festival last year. Keelan is whip smart, and this book is getting really, really huge praise. So I'm so excited to get to talk to her. And the next Australian normal programming B-List Book Club is nonfiction, Fathoms by Rebecca Giggs. And the link to the event for Fathoms, I believe, is not up yet, but will be very soon. And that's all from me, and that's all from Robbie. Thank you again so much for joining us, Robbie. I loved both of your books so much. Actually, one final killer question. What are you working on next?
Oh, I've got a contract for a 3rd novel, so I'm working on that now. I'm going insane.
Wow.
Yeah, it's going to be quite short. Yeah, but I'm working on that at the moment, and yeah, it's happening. I loved Fathoms, by the way. I read that recently. I really enjoyed it. So just a quick endorsement for Fathoms. I thought it was wonderful.
Great. Well, on that very exciting note, thank you so much, everyone, for watching. Thank you, Robbie. Have a lovely night.
Thank you. Thank you so much.